Hey everyone, I'm Chris Thompson, and this is session number 9 of Brain Software with Dr. Mike Mandel. He has Jason Statham's hair, Angus Young's guitar, and makes an excellent beef bourguignon. Mike?
Thanks, Chris. Great to be back here in our studios in downtown Toronto, Canada, the center of world hypnosis.
As always. So today I think we have a really exciting show planned that will be useful for those of you out there who are therapists, but also to everyone else, right?
Absolutely. If you are a hypnotherapist or a psychotherapist, you'll find some interesting tools in this particular episode. But if you're not one, you'll still find things that will be applicable to your life.
Okay, Mike, so this session is all about therapy. So let's get going right off the bat. And I want you to start by telling everybody about the Mandel model of therapy, because I know you have a particular viewpoint on how therapy should be done. And I think it's quite unique and original.
Well, that's interesting. I'm going to let the quite unique pass, although I am the,
redundancy police.
Yeah, language policeman. But we will let that horrible infraction go, Chris.
Okay.
Unique can have no modifiers. It's either one of a kind or it isn't.
And I suppose unique and original is just highly unique and
highly
original.
Unique and extremely original. Yeah, terrible. Terrible stuff. Anyway, the Mandel model of therapy basically says there's a few things that if you keep them in mind, you'll do pretty excellent work a lot of the time. And one of the aspects of this is I like to work with clean states, meaning if someone's in trance, I want them to be zoned through the floor in a deep trance. If someone is wide awake and fully aware, I want them to be wide awake and fully aware. I don't want some sort of muddy blending between different states. So you always want to work with the cleanest possible states you can, whether it's a resource state or you're removing something problematic. So step 1 says always work with clean states. Don't let them get muddy and jostle into each other.
Okay, and what is step number 2?
Well, step number 2, or part number 2, basically says de-traumatize first. So no matter what somebody comes in for, there's a young gymnast I'm working with right now who's got world-class skills. He doesn't actually have any trauma underlying his current situation. He just wants generative change and wants to do things better. But most of the time when someone comes in with a problematic behavior, whether it's a phobia or insomnia or whatever, if you do a bit of digging, and usually it's just a modicum of digging, you will discover that there is something traumatic, something negative, whether it's fear, anger, sadness, grief, something under the surface that is driving the problem. And once you eliminate this, you start with a tabula rasa, you start with a blank slate, and then you can begin to build resources on top of that. So you want to wipe the slate clean first.
All right, so speaking of de-traumatization, should we get into that now or save a discussion on it for later in terms of the modes of therapy that you would use to de-traumatize?
Yeah, maybe we'll come back to the modes of therapy in a moment. One of the particular aspects of looking at therapy I came up with a while back is the idea of a labyrinth. The assumption that the client, subject, patient, whatever, depending on one's qualifications, is stuck in a labyrinth, a horrible maze with problems, dead ends, no way out. And of course, in a labyrinth, you also get a minotaur, which is half bull and half man. And there's a lot of metaphorical stuff there I won't get into. But the basic idea is you cannot enter the labyrinth as much as you would like to, perhaps, and drag the subject kicking and screaming out, having beaten up or slaughtered the minotaur for them. The person must leave the labyrinth under their own volition. Now, as a therapist, you can coax them into leaving, you can empower them into leaving, but they have to kill the minotaur themselves if they encounter it, and they have to leave the labyrinth themselves under their own power. When they do that, then you have someone who is truly at threshold, and they'll make powerful, powerful changes. But otherwise, if you attempt too much to do the work for them, it simply won't last because you're not making unconscious change. It has to come from them. I can't remember who said it, but there's the adage, you are not only your own best therapist, you are your own only therapist. The bottom line is we have to wind up doing the work ourselves, whether it's installing resource states or accessing trauma and deleting it. It's really down to us.
It really comes down to that model of you can only be a coach to the person you're trying to help. You can't do the work for them. They have to want that change. And we've talked before about getting leverage and getting to threshold, right? I mean, this comes back again and again, doesn't it?
Yes, threshold is key to this. Something has to change. It has to be me, and it has to be now. And I would see people a lot of the time who were not at threshold, who would think they were. They'd say, yes, I have to quit smoking, or I have to quit overeating, or whatever it is. And when I'd investigate further, it would be because their husband or wife was on their case. So they realize something has to change. It has to be now. But they were not to the point that it was something has to change, and it's me that is the thing that has to change here. So they have to fulfill every criteria in order to be at threshold. Now, it's noteworthy when you're working with people therapeutically, although I work with a lot of different methods, the method is really the least important thing. A number of years ago, I had lunch with John Grinder in Toronto, and he asked me an interesting question. He said, if you could distill NLP down to the 4 most important things, what would they be? And I thought for a minute, and I came up with metamodel, rapport, congruence, and calibration. And my memory jog for that is MRCC, Mr. CC. If I remember that, I can come up with the 4 when needed. And it's true. In fact, he said this was an accurate answer because you have to have the metamodel. If you don't have information gathering skills where you can be very specific with your language and ask questions, someone says, oh, I'm unhappy. How specifically are you creating this unhappiness? Oh, so-and-so doesn't like me. Whatever it is, you have to have a meta-model challenge that you can throw back to them. Like, how do you know if the person doesn't like you? What is their behavior towards you? Whatever it is, you need specificity in your information gathering to find out what's happening and help them enlarge and enrich their map of the world. So how specifically, what specifically, all of the challenges of generalization, deletion, and distortion that are axiomatic in the use of the Milton model are all violations in the other side of the coin, the meta model. You have to be specific in your language to get your information to begin with. Now, the second one, rapport, there's actually 3 R's of therapy and hypnosis, which are rapport, and rapport, which is the French word rapport, but we're going to use the English one, rapport, because this is an English program. And when one has rapport with the client, then when you start to lead them, they will follow you. Once you begin to pace them sufficiently, you open the door, build a bridge between the two of you that they can then respond to. I remember John Grinder said one of the keys of rapport, and this has helped me immeasurably, was the missing ingredient a lot of the time is, you get someone modeling a client's spinal tilt and verbal predicates, and all these different things, and breathing rate and blink rate, but they are leaving out one key part of the pattern that makes a difference. It is the difference that makes a difference. You must pretend the person you are working with is the most interesting person in the universe. If you can pretend that and pretend you aren't pretending anymore, a lot of the time you will get an amazing rapport from that alone.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I've heard you teach us that in class, in the hypnosis class that you teach down at NLP Canada. And
NLP Canada training.
NLP Canada training, right. And I completely agree. The idea of establishing powerful rapport can be as simple as just acting like the other person is totally interesting and fascinating.
Yes, and often we'll find out then they are, because everybody has something to offer. So that brings us past the meta model, rapport, to the next one, which is the letter C, which is congruence. When you are congruent, your body language, your words, your internal state, everything is completely aligned. If you want to see congruence, look at a little kid asking for something they want for Christmas. Oh, can I have it? Can I have it? Oh, just let me have it. They're totally aligned in what they want. And when we are aligned, when our body language and our tonality and everything is sending the same message, we'll be far more effective as therapists. You know incongruence as soon as you hear it. It's the ellipsis, the ... at the end of a sentence. Oh, how do you like our new house? Oh, it's nice. But you can hear the ... That's incongruent. But if the person says, oh, it's fantastic, I love it, you can tell they mean it. Their body language, everything is aligned with it. Congruence will get you a heck of a lot very, very quickly. And the last one, of course, is calibration. Calibration is you have to see what you can see and hear what you can hear and feel what you can feel. A lot of people don't even glance at their client for half the session, and you have to be able to notice external analog changes in the other person's behavior, whether it's skin tonus or breathing rate or pupil size, whatever. If you don't calibrate them at the beginning of the session, how are you going to notice that their state has shifted if you're not seeing it, because you're not looking to begin with? I saw one hypnotist who paced up and down while doing trance work and never even looked at the subject. Well, he's not calibrating at all. It's just not possible.
You know, Mike, what you said about congruence, it really reminds me of what I learned from you about the word try and how it implies failure. And so quick story from this weekend, my wife and a bunch of her old high school friends, they swim every Sunday morning, and they're always emailing each other on the Saturday night to verify who's going to be there, who's not going to be there. And one of the girls, she had a party to go to on the Saturday night, so probably a lot of drinking involved. And she had mentioned how even though she was going to be home late, she would absolutely try her best to be at practice. And I got to tell you, as soon as I saw that email, I just said to my wife, honey, yeah, she's not going to be at practice. Oh, how do you know that? Well, just read the email. It's plain as day, just in the way that she worded it. And sure enough, she didn't show up for practice.
Yeah, I mean, trying implies failure. What if at first you don't succeed? Try again. And fail, and try and fail. It's built right in.
Yeah, it's so avoid using the word try, everybody. It's
certainly if you want to be congruent.
Yeah, and if you want to get something done, don't say I'm going to try to do it. Do it.
Yes, let your yes be yes and your no be no.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to just do it. All right, so let's move on then. We talked about calibration as the last thing I think you described, and so you've talked about rapport, congruence, meta model. Now let's talk about installing resources. Actually, Mike, before we go to talking about installing resources, I wanted to come back to the comment that you made about having the patient or the subject has to make the change himself. He has to get himself out of the labyrinth. He has to kill the Minotaur himself. What have you seen in terms of other therapeutic models where incorrect work is being done? For example, the therapist is trying to make the change for the patient, or, you know, it could be any relationship, really. It could be a spouse trying to make a change happen for another spouse, or a friend and another friend, or whatever it is, a parent and a child.
Right, and the person's not at threshold, so they're not about to change. And one of the things you'll also see when working with other people, somebody will perhaps do hypnosis work with a client, and they'll rush it. The way you go faster with hypnosis is paradoxically to go slower. And by slowing down and letting the person take time to access these powerful kinesthetic states, then you'll get the maximum amount of change in the minimum amount of time. But we must be calibrating as we go. I worked with a man last week who was doing some timeline therapy. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's Dr. Tad James's work. I highly recommend his materials. He's done some phenomenal work with timeline. I think University of Calgary Medical Center or something is using it now. Amazing. Great way of getting to de-traumatize a lot of situations, a lot of problems, removing negative decisions and disempowering decisions from the past, and then allowing the effect to move into the future. Easy stuff. I mean, powerful, but relatively easy to use. And I was working with a man and got to the end of the session, and I had set up idiomotor signals with him, finger signals for yes and no from the unconscious. And I thought, that the work was done. I was convinced it was all done. I was getting signals that everything was done. And I asked his unconscious mind, is all the work done now? Fully expecting to get a resounding yes. And instead I got an instant no. I went, okay, is there more work you want to do now? No. Okay. And I started probing and discovered it was because the things we had changed had such a resonance, such a powerful shift, that his unconscious mind wanted the effects to continue to resonate and let everything drop into place properly before making any other changes. So now we're back to the whole thing of don't do too much in one session. You have to work within the person's own ability to change, which can be an amazingly rapid change. It can be a huge amount of change in one session, but you have to make sure you're within their parameters. So I said to the unconscious, will you make the necessary changes later today when you are convinced everything has resonated and calmed down and fallen into place and the change is integrated? And it gave me a yes signal. And I said, will you guarantee that you will have done the work by midnight? And it said, yes. I said, okay, we're done. Brought him out of trance, got a glowing email from him a few days later, and the changes that had happened in his life over the last week have been absolutely amazing. Now, if I had just rushed by that, even going with my fairly considerable calibration skills and thinking the work was done without actually checking my work, I would have run into problems with him and not known why.
And this is interesting because I think this comes back to rapport as well. By checking and by validating that, in fact, he still had work left to do, or in his case, maybe his belief system suggested he just thought that he needed more time to integrate, and therefore
That could be it.
you
Yep.
gave him that time. You're building even more rapport with his unconscious as opposed to just leaving it hanging and having the work not really done yet.
Yes, and one of the other interesting things that erupted in that particular case that startled me was it gave me a rare opportunity to use something I developed, and I'd like the hypnotherapists out there to play with this. It's called retrograde suggestion, and I came up with this a number of years ago. And basically, what it involves is when you have someone in a trance, which can be a moderate trance or a deep trance, it doesn't really matter that much, but you want them beyond just a superficial trance or hypnoidal state, you then make reference to a suggestion you made earlier at the other session or earlier today, whatever, even though you never did. And you get the person to nod in agreement. So it's, you recall, of course, that I told you that if you did not like the timeline the way we had changed it, all you would have to do was click on the icon we created and you'd be able to switch it back. Do you remember that? Or you remember that, don't you? And the person nods, and that installs it instantly in a retrograde fashion, even though it was never actually done. And the unconscious, of course, knows that the instruction was never given. But if I have sufficient rapport with the patient, client, subject, whatever, the unconscious will tongue-in-cheek pretend that it knows I did that and will act just as though I had, and his unconscious mind will have no recollection that this suggestion never took place.
That is really interesting. I like that. I'm going to have to remember that one. Okay, so let's talk about installing resources then, because I think I got us on a bit of a tangent coming back to...
Tangents can be good, Chris.
Tangents can be good. What do you think are some of the best ways to install resources rather than just locate them for people?
Okay, well, again, one of the problems I see over and over and over is someone does very good hypnotic work, finds the necessary resources, and although my model says de-traumatize first, start with the tabula rasa, clean the slate, there is a degree of truth to the idea that if you stack sufficient positive anchors and resource states on top of each other, that will sometimes automatically obliterate any negative states. It's sort of like stacking anchors or collapsing anchors. But I think it's better to routinely go after the negative stuff and wipe it out, just to be on the safe side. Start with a clean foundation that you're building on. I said before, if you're building a brand new house, you don't build it on the foundation of an outhouse. You want to dig that all out first and pour in fresh concrete. You won't clean that sucker up. So it's the same with the human mind. The problem, if you can call it a problem, let's say weakness or insufficiency with some of the older forms of neurolinguistic programming. The problem is that you want to get a resource, so you go into the person's personal history, presuming they had it at some point, and you take this dipper and you dip down and grab this resource from their past, and with all the junk that's attached to it, including context and other internal dialogue at the time and all these other things, and then you bring it and you install it in the future so that they're in the right context and this state fires, but it's bringing all the junk with it too. That's why I think the best type of building in resource is completely free of garbage. We're back to the Mandel idea of working with clean states always. And so I prefer John Grinder's new code insofar as his method does not go into personal history, but it creates a high-performance state and then grafts it in the context it's needed in the future and permits it to fire automatically without any imperfections or any problems from the past.
Okay, so maybe for the hypnotherapists out there, this is a good discussion point. When you actually grab those clean resource states or create them, how do you install them?
Well, there's a number of modalities or methodologies for doing this, including a lot of things John Grinder came up with, like Walking with Grace and Power and Dock of the Bay. And basically, you're generating the state and you're setting up a context that it will fire. Anybody who wants to do a new code course can learn this fairly quickly, and there's a lot of great information out there. John's book, Whispering in the Wind, is fantastic in this regard as well. Highly recommended. The other thing that you brought up here, Chris, that was rather interesting, I'm just backing this up a bit. When we talked about installation of resources and the idea of what I've run into many times, I see a very good hypnotist or therapist. They take the person back in a trance state, they find the resources they need, and they do all their work nice and clean and neat and bring the person out, but they're not fixed. Mm-hmm. And they seem to be, and then they leave the office and either the resources are tagged with the office, and unless they're in there, they don't have them, or more likely, they get something which is called a proximity installation. And by that I mean it's equivalent to going to a computer store like Future Shop or something, and you need a piece of software for your computer. So you go in and you look around the shelves and you find it. You go, oh, here it is. Here's the defrag program I need. This is the one. And then you put it back on the shelf and walk out of the store and wonder why your computer's still screwed up. Well, you never installed it. So people find resources, but you've got to install them. Otherwise, finding them will start to have the person indicate through their congruence and their shift in state that you have found the right one. You'll start to see the change in them. But it's an induction, almost like an electromagnetic induction by being close to the resource. It's not actually entering into their being and changing them. They're just showing evidence of being near the resource. So you must make the installation of the resource concomitant with coming out of trance or something else. And it can be as simple as, and you will not come out of that trance until the new resources are fully installed and working perfectly and ecologically for you. And come out whenever you're ready, wide awake now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the metaphor works. It makes a lot of sense that, whether it be software on the bookshelf or not bookshelf, software on the electronic store shelf or it's the equivalent of, I know I should eat healthy, but until I actually start cooking myself healthier meals and putting them into my mouth, I'm not eating healthier.
Right, it's not working, yeah.
Yeah, and then until I go to the gym, I'm not going to get more fit.
Absolutely. It must be done. You got to do the work.
You can't just be aware of what you should do or be aware of that resourceful state. You have to install it.
Install it and get it running. Switch it on. That's what brain software is, and that's why we call this podcast Brain Software. It's about changing programs, rewriting them, accessing them, and putting them in and making them run properly.
So if for those listeners who have the Peak Performance CD and they have learned the Dock of the Bay edit that you teach on that CD.
Or Walking with Grace and Power.
Yeah, the installation in particular, I'm thinking of Dock of the Bay. There's 3 resource states that they get access to. How are they installed within that personal edit?
Well, the person is pretty well physically drawing them in.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's that imagination of the union of the imagined person sitting out there on the dock, and then the you imagining them, and
then pulling that person in with their physical hands. New Code has a lot of physical motion involved, which really helps the physiology change.
Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing people almost, I mean, in a happy way when I say this, just to pre-frame it, break down into tears. You know what I mean?
Yes, because the transition is so great. Yeah,
they get very emotional about the powerful states that they've just created and installed, and they get overwhelmed with emotion. And
speaking of overwhelmed with emotion, Chris, I think it's probably time to do our therapeutic metaphor.
Oh, I think that sounds like a perfect idea.
And we'll pick up more ideas in this in the future. If you have any questions about therapeutic adaptations of any of the things I'm teaching or talking about, send us an email to info@MikeMandelHypnosis.com.
Yeah, questions at Mike Mandel Hypnosis.
Disregard what I said and listen to him.
I run this site, I guess, so I should know, right? Yeah, if you send it to questions at Mike Mandel Hypnosis, then we both get it. If you send it to info at Mike Mandel Hypnosis, then only I get it, and I forward the important ones over to Mike, too.
Excellent. Well, here's the therapeutic metaphor for today, and it's the story of the Tesseract, which for the mathematicians in the audience is a fourth-dimensional cube. I call it that for a reason. Basically, if one looks into different dimensions in any depth, and apparently there are 10 of them, 10 will contain every bit of the universe we know, and whether we're talking about string theory, whatever, it doesn't really matter. I had a really interesting experience when I was about 8 years old that seemed to be interdimensional, and like all good metaphors, this one is true and came from my own personal experience, as I said. I was living with my parents because at 8 years old, one typically does not launch out on one's own, and we were living at 58 Woodington Avenue in Toronto, directly across the street from Earl Beatty Public School, which I attended. And in the living room of 58 Woodington, there was a big easy chair, stuffed easy chair, sitting in the corner by the front window. And one day, my mother and I had walked to the local grocery store, which we often did, and she had her bundle buggy. And if I was a good boy, she'd buy me something. Things were like $1 each, and different toys and soldiers and knives and stuff, which were awesome when you're a kid. And she bought me this tin, blue-colored kazoo that was shaped like a saxophone. And I loved this thing, and I walked home humming it, all these songs and stuff, and thought it was the greatest thing in the world. Loved it, carried it everywhere. Well, a couple of nights later, I was in the easy chair in our front room just before sundown, and I lifted myself up in the chair, like sort of standing up in it, and I had my hand over the back of the chair with the kazoo in my hand. And it slipped out of my hand, but I never heard it hit the floor. And I said, what the heck? And I'm looking over the back of the chair, couldn't see it. I hauled the big easy chair out, took the one cushion out, and there was nowhere for it to go. There was no ventilation. I looked everywhere, and that stupid kazoo never showed up ever. But there's a weird sequel to this. Months later, my father, who was an electrical engineer, he and I were playing in the living room. And, father-son game, we had a batarang I'd made out of popsicle sticks and glued them together and stuck paper on and made it the shape of a bat. And this is when Batman was in the comics, long before it was ever on TV or films or whatever. And we were throwing this back and forth. And he threw it to me, and I was in that same corner chair. It went over my head on an arc and intersected the corner of the room. And my dad said it just disappeared. And we pulled the chair out, and I still hear my dad cursing to himself as an engineer. He said, where's that damn thing gone? And we searched and searched, and all I can assume is the batarang wound up somewhere, and it has company because I think the kazoo saxophone is there with it.
I think I get that metaphor, but I won't say any more.
Excellent.
So that wraps up podcast session number 9 of Brain Software with Dr. Mike Mandel. And as always, I'll remind you to send in your questions to questions@MikeMandelHypnosis.com, 1 L in Mandel. Head on over to the website, MikeMandelHypnosis.com, and sign up for our email list so that we can send you all kinds of free stuff that we're working on. And head on over to iTunes if you're listening from there and leave a rating for the show. So and
also, Chris, before I forget, if anyone is interested in coming to Toronto and studying with me in April, and studying hypnosis for NLP Canada training, either send us an email or one to NLP Canada training. And Chris and I are looking to do another training in the late summer, July or August, which will be a week-long training for therapists and international students and people with no previous experience of hypnosis. So instead of 2 weekends, this will be a week. So you can come in on the weekend and fly out the following weekend.
Fantastic. And for those of you looking for information on that April class, go to nlpcanada.com. That's where you can get the sign-up information and payment information, all that kind of stuff.
Hope to see you there.
So that's it for podcast episode number 9. See you again next time.
Well, I said to the reporter, it's not about the money at all. It's never been about the money. It's about the band. It's about keeping the band together and playing the music. We just want to keep the music out there, play great songs like this one.